Welcome to Law and the Machine, where artificial intelligence meets the legal system, liability, regulation, intellectual property, and the government's uncomfortable role as both rulemaker and AI adopter. The law wasn't written for this.
The surprising finding is that when it comes to artificial intelligence, weak regulation isn't just ineffective, it might actually be worse than having no regulation at all.
That's right. The research suggests that weak regulatory frameworks create a kind of liability offload, where the responsibility for harm shifts away from the developers and deployers of AI systems, landing instead on the users or the public. It's a counterintuitive argument, but a potent one.
So it's not just about a missed opportunity for safety, it's about actively creating a more dangerous or less accountable environment. How does a weak regulatory framework achieve that?
It often legitimizes inadequate standards. When there's some regulation, even if it's minimal or poorly enforced, it can create a false sense of security. Companies might point to compliance with these weak rules as evidence of their AI safety, even if those rules don't address the actual risks. It's a bit like having a car safety inspection that only checks if the horn works, then telling drivers their vehicle is perfectly safe.
That analogy makes sense. So rather than pushing companies to innovate on safety, it might inadvertently encourage them to just meet the lowest possible bar. And the term liability offload really gets to the core of this. Can you unpack what that looks like in practice? Who precisely is offloading what and to whom?
Essentially, AI developers and those who implement AI systems into products or services are the ones offloading. They're shifting the financial, legal, and reputational risk associated with AI-driven errors or harms. The burden then falls on individual users who might suffer financial loss, personal injury, or discrimination, or on society at large, which bears the costs of systemic failures or a loss of trust. For example, if an AI-powered diagnostic tool makes an error and the regulations around its development were vague, it becomes much harder to hold the developer accountable. The patient or even the doctor who used the tool might bear the brunt.
That's a significant point. It moves from hypothetical harm to very real, tangible consequences for individuals. But why would regulators or governments even create such weak frameworks in the first place? It seems self-defeating.
There are several factors at play. One major driver is often intense lobbying from the AI industry itself. Companies, particularly large incumbents, often advocate for light-touch regulation or voluntary guidelines, arguing that strict rules would stifle innovation.
So effectively, they're helping write the rules that they'll then have to follow, which conveniently happen to be rules that benefit their business models. That sounds like a classic case of regulatory capture.
Exactly. Another factor is the genuine challenge regulators face in keeping up with rapidly evolving technology. There's often a significant knowledge gap, making it difficult to craft effective future-proof regulations. And then there's the broader policy concern about competitiveness. Governments want their national AI industries to thrive, so they might shy away from regulations perceived as burdensome. The result is often a preference for soft law, things like ethical principles, voluntary codes of conduct, or best practices, rather than legally binding and enforceable rules.
Soft law, voluntary guidelines, that's not exactly a robust shield for the public when something goes wrong.
It's not. These approaches often lack enforcement mechanisms, clear metrics for compliance, or accountability structures. They project an image of responsibility without necessarily delivering on it, further contributing to that false sense of security we discussed earlier.
Consider a specific instance where the lines between AI regulator, contractor, and lobbyist blur.
And on today's docket, we have a recent example involving a leading AI development firm, Cognito Corp., and its influence on emerging federal AI standards. Cognito Corp's former head of public policy, a prominent figure in the AI ethics space, was recently appointed to a key advisory position within the National AI Regulatory Steering Committee, a body tasked with drafting the initial set of AI safety guidelines for critical infrastructure applications.
That sounds like a revolving door situation, almost by design. This individual, fresh from advocating for Cognito Corp's interests, is now helping define the very rules that Cognito Corp and its competitors will operate under.
Indeed. What's particularly notable is that during this committee's drafting process, several proposals for mandatory pre-market algorithmic impact assessments and independent third-party audits were significantly watered down. The final draft guidelines, which are now largely voluntary, emphasize developer-led self-assessment and best effort reporting, positions that Cognito Corp had publicly advocated for in the past.
So the argument that strict regulations would stifle innovation seems to have won out, with a familiar face at the table. It's a scenario where the advice on how to regulate AI is coming directly from those who stand to gain from minimal regulation.
And the impact is clear. The resulting guidelines, while framed as a step towards AI safety, essentially institutionalize a framework where the primary responsibility for assessing and mitigating risk remains with the developers themselves rather than with an independent oversight body. This directly contributes to that liability offload mechanism we're discussing.
So the question for listeners is this: when the architects of AI systems are also the primary architects of their regulation, who truly benefits from the blueprint?
It's a critical question. When these weak frameworks are in place, the consequences can be far-reaching. Without clear liability and robust standards, developers have less incentive to invest in thorough testing, security measures, or rigorous risk assessments. Why spend extra resources if the legal and financial repercussions of failure are minimal or easily deflected?
It essentially allows a race to the bottom, where corners are cut not just to save money, but because the regulatory environment permits it.
Precisely. This can lead to a degradation of safety across the industry. It can also erode public trust in AI systems. If people see AI-driven errors or harms occurring with little accountability, their willingness to adopt or even tolerate these technologies diminishes. And for companies genuinely investing in safer AI, weak regulation can create a perverse market distortion where they are at a disadvantage compared to competitors who prioritize speed and cost over safety.
Because the market doesn't differentiate as clearly if the regulatory floor is so low. It's not just about the harms that do happen, but the ones that could happen because the incentives aren't aligned with safety.
Absolutely. And when harms do occur, the legal landscape becomes incredibly complex. Assigning blame, proving causation, and securing redress for victims becomes an uphill battle in the absence of clear liability rules and technical standards. This can lead to protracted and expensive litigation, further burdening individuals and the justice system. The ultimate risk is that these weak standards become entrenched, making it even harder to introduce more effective regulation down the line.
So, if weak regulation is the problem, what does effective regulation look like? What are the key components needed to avoid this liability offload and genuinely promote safe and responsible AI?
Effective regulation, according to the research, starts with clear and unambiguous allocation of liability. Developers and deployers of AI systems need to know they will be held responsible for harms caused by their products. Beyond that, it requires mandatory risk assessments, robust transparency requirements, and, crucially, some form of pre-market approval or certification for high-risk AI applications.
Like how new drugs or medical devices need to be approved before they can be sold to the public.
Exactly. And not just pre-market. There needs to be post-market surveillance. AI systems aren't static, they learn and evolve. So continuous monitoring, auditing, and the ability to recall or update systems that pose new risks are essential. Finally, it requires regulatory bodies with adequate technical expertise, sufficient resources, and the clear authority to enforce these rules. The focus needs to shift from purely process-oriented compliance to outcome-oriented accountability, ensuring that AI systems are actually safe and fair in practice, not just on paper.
To synthesize this, 3 core takeaways emerge from the discussion. First, weak AI regulation isn't a benign compromise. It actively creates a more dangerous and less accountable environment, effectively legitimizing inadequate standards. Second, the liability offload is a central mechanism here, where the true costs and risks of AI failures are systematically shifted from powerful developers and deployers onto individual users and the public. This erodes trust and disincentivizes true safety. And third, achieving genuinely effective AI regulation demands clear liability frameworks, mandatory pre- and post-market safety checks, and regulatory bodies empowered with both expertise and enforcement authority, moving beyond voluntary guidelines and soft law.
It's about ensuring that the responsibility for safety resides with those who design and deploy these powerful systems, rather than simply hoping for the best.
This leaves a question for listeners to consider. In a world where AI is constantly evolving, can regulators ever truly get ahead of the curve with robust frameworks, or are they destined to always be playing catch-up, inevitably leading to these cycles of weak, reactive regulation?
That's all for Law and the Machine. Join us next time as we continue exploring where AI and the law collide. If you found this useful, subscribe. We appreciate it.
The law will catch up, eventually.